Well, thank you everybody, and a very, very warm welcome to our Financial Intelligence Unit event. I'm delighted you could join us and really excited that such a broad spread of sectors and public and private partners are here today. It's a real privilege for me to speak to you 1 year on from when I arrived on the island to be the director and head of the jurisdiction's new FIU and only National Intelligence Agency. Nobody warned me of the intensity to come. 2023 was a real baptism of fire. Preparation for and delivery of our Moneyval assessment laid bare the integral position of the FIU and the transformation we need to deliver. We were the only agency to be involved every day, front and centre on so many aspects. But that was the past. Today is about the future. Collaboration and partnerships is our focus. You will see that in how we have structured the sessions. So what will be happening this morning? To start with, we have the Government of Jersey's perspective from Deputy Ian Gorst. And even before I know what he's about to say, I will take the brave move of thanking him and, of course, Deputy Elaine Miller for their support, oversight and leadership over the past few years in the critical deliverables related to Moneyval, as well as for their more recent FIU transformation programme support. The FIU's function and priorities are based on the priorities of the government. Positively, these two ministers demonstrate an inherent understanding of the financial crime risks and the relevance of the financial services sector to the economy of the island. It is the only strategic threat the island really faces, and tackling it requires a dedicated, well-supported and independent financial intelligence capability. So after that, we'll have some messages from friends and allies that couldn't make it. 4 of the most experienced and influential colleagues that cover FIUs, Moneyval, the regulated sector, global partnerships, and intelligence. We will then have a focus on the FIU and our future direction. And then the importance of FIU to FIU collaboration and a panel of FIUs. And I will seek to come up with a collective noun for that as we go on. A focus on public-private partnerships and an introduction to JFIN, our very own one, before another panel, this time on public-private partnerships, and probably another collective noun that I need to think about. Then we'll let you have a coffee, and then we'll return and we'll introduce you to our special guest who has a unique viewpoint on both the Middle East and terrorist financing. And we will finish with an Authors and Insight panel that brings together some real experts on the Middle East and terrorist financing to give you a flavour of the types of things that we believe are important. And we aim to get you away just after midday. So plenty to look forward to. But I'm an FIU, so I'm going to start with some data. And this is the breakdown of who registered for today. 245 people, although I believe that there's a few more in the room now. And it's great to see on this that the TCSP sector, the fund sector, and the banking sector are so well represented. It's a good mix, but we also recognise there remain some gaps here. And we will do some of our own analysis in relation to our engagement approaches. We also have the public sector here, of course, and you'll notice it's not just local. There are 8% international guests, and that's incredibly important to us. And I'd particularly like to thank those international friends who have joined us today. And I hope you get an opportunity to see some of this beautiful and friendly island. I'd finally just like to finish by thanking my FIU team for their commitment and assistance over the past period, in particular in pulling together this event, but also for Mike, Richard, Katie, and indeed David, who are part of my leadership team at the moment, who have provided continued guidance, balance, and loyalty in the change thus far. And lastly, and I hope you'll agree, a massive thank you to Tommy, my engagement head, for his professionalism and unstinting support as we pulled this event and the FIU brand and messaging together over the past 6 months. And with that, I'd now like to invite the Minister for Financial Services, Deputy Ian Gorst, to the stage.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's good to be back. Of course, it's not quite true that I've ever been away. Deputy Miller and I've supported her in her work during the last government, and we will be working together on the remit of financial services during what we hope is the next 2 years of this government. What has, of course, undoubtedly changed over recent years is our approach to tackling financial crime. Many of you will be aware of the series of reforms that Jersey has gone through since around 2020. Those reforms are outlined in our financial crime strategy published in 2022, and at the centre of those reforms is ensuring that our authorities are fit for purpose for the threats that Jersey faces. Our entire approach to financial crime strategy has become far more driven by risk over the last 3 or 4 years, and of course at the heart of understanding risk is threat, and threat is informed by intelligence. That is why reform of the Financial Intelligence Unit has been so fundamental and has been an important pillar of our reform since 2020. Where we've arrived at today is the result of a very deliberate and sustained effort by not only the government but the island agencies to invest in our intelligent capacity and to develop the appropriate structure and format for an FIU that is right for Jersey. As many as you know, there have been a substantive amount of legislative change which has passed through the States Assembly, those international guests, that's our Parliament, accompanied by substantial investment of funding, resulting in enhanced human and technology resources. And I understand that you're going to hear more about that later during the course of today and what the plans are for those resources and their development into the future. This development, let me be clear, sometimes in small communities there is wittering and talking, but let me be absolutely clear, it's entirely supported by the Government of Jersey and by the ministerial team. And it's designed very deliberately to place intelligence at the centre of our efforts to fight financial crime. So what we see here today is in FIU-Jersey is an organisation that over a relatively short period of time, and that's in no small part thanks to those people who populate the FIU, has transformed from being an operational police department, and it worked well. The chief's in the room, so I've got to thank him over the years for the work that the police have done. Let's be clear, it's not been straightforward for them to operate this sort of unit within the police department, and they have our grateful thanks. But it has been transformed from that police department to an independent agency with its own governance board, providing statutory reporting back to ministers and then, of course, onward to the States Assembly. The importance and necessity of having an independent FIU is recognised globally and became absolutely evident during our on-site part of the Moneyval assessment that we went through last year. We of course can't, as George constantly reminds us at this stage, discuss the substance of the Moneyval report as it's currently in draft and subject to ongoing discussions with assessors, a normal part of any assessment to understand our compliance with FATF standards. And so we'll all have to wait until the 24th of July when there will be another event here in Jersey to talk through the contents of that report. But what I can say about the visit of the assessors is that the FIU were involved, and I'm told in all but 2 of the sessions with the assessors while they were here. And that demonstrates just how vital their work is to us as an international finance centre. So I'm grateful to them and for all the work that they have undertaken in the work of transformation. But it isn't finished. It is actually only the start. And I know that during the course of this morning, you are going to hear about their work, an understanding from an international perspective of just how important their work is and independent FIUs are, but also where we as government and you as industry fit into understanding risk, dealing with threats, and helping inform intelligence. So thank you very much indeed for coming this morning. I know the FIU appreciate it. We certainly in the ministerial team appreciate it. So thank you very much, and we wish you a successful and not too boring day. Thank you.
So thank you very much. I don't do boring, Minister, so you'll be pleased to hear. So I'd like to sort of start off with talking about the FIU and our focus and our priorities and why ultimately we need to change. There is sort of a key message that if you don't go away with anything else, please go away with sort of these thoughts today. As Jersey's only independent intelligence agency, our focus is on tackling the island's prime strategic threat, financial crime. To do this, we are dependent on a number of things: knowledge, sound analytic standards and deliverables, collaboration and partnerships. We cannot do this alone. Last year, government and the authorities used the logo Combating Financial Crime Together. That together message was critical to us and to the other authorities in messaging to the Moneyval assessment team as we prepared, planned and presented. Together will no doubt shape the recommended actions that come from Moneyval, and together will help shape the FIU's ongoing development. So expertise, standards and togetherness remain key in our broad strategy. So how do we go about this then? Well, we see that the future must more effectively tackle financial crime as it relates to an international finance centre. And this is ultimately enabled through that knowledge, partnerships and collaboration. And that all has to be with our own people, with you, the industry, and with our domestic and international partners. Singularly, we will likely fail, but collectively, we can achieve much. In the words of Henry Ford, coming together is a beginning, keeping together is progress, but working together is success. But why should we change? So, critically, it is to better support that international finance centre position. And we do this by professionalising the capability and making it appropriate for Jersey, as the Minister said. So let's consider that for a moment. Jersey holds an influential position as a leading international finance centre. And the threat landscape, as we've talked about, has evolved, and financial crime and abuse is a primary strategic threat, not just here, but all over the world. That threat is globally connected, so we must refocus on international priorities. And we need informed approaches to better prioritise and understand that evolving threat as it all pulls together. We need to deliver insight and influence to a much, much broader set of stakeholders, and that has to be done through an impactful product suite. Intelligence sources and technology have also developed beyond all recognition over the past few years, and we must access better data and utilise better and more informed technologies. Finally, and globally, there is a changing focus and a belief in the capabilities of FIUs and a better understanding of what they can and indeed should be delivering. To support those thoughts then, a few realities. Financial crime has been identified as a national security threat in many countries. Estimates vary, but between 1 and 3 trillion US dollars is laundered globally every year. And despite the billions that are spent to combat the threat, less than 1% of the proceeds of crime are recovered. At the recent World Economic Forum, Catherine de Boll, the head of Europol, stated that across Europe, only 10% of STRs are used and 90% dismissed. There is a quality issue. And it's also been highlighted that significant gaps exist across certain sectors, and there's a question about willful blindness. So this isn't just the FIU becoming independent. This is about a new mindset we collectively need to have. Sun Tzu in The Art of War states that a key principle of success when tackling an enemy is that you must seek to modify your tactics in relation to your opponent if you are to succeed and win. We can't keep on with the continual madness that we have at the moment. We need to deliver effectiveness and a collective identification of the most important areas to focus on. Learning with new systems and crediting the provision of insight rather than criticising the finding of more risk. Empowering the FIU to inform across a range of stakeholders and recalibrating to identify more hidden international risks. We need to learn, train, and support one another to help us understand that threat and constantly think about the so what to Jersey and the so what to an international finance centre. This will involve cultivating a new culture and a different spread of international partnerships. But ultimately, I'm also conscious that we have to enable business. This isn't just about putting up brick walls. It is about helping business and helping the economy and helping the IFC to do things safely. So how do we change? We're evolving in 2024, and to support independence and drive effectiveness, we've already identified numerous gaps that need addressing. Expanding our own knowledge and understanding is, of course, critical. Growing collaborative and mutually beneficial information sharing partnerships and public-private partnerships are key. And delivering a better product with clearer assessment and sourcing that is tactically relevant, operationally insightful, and strategically influential. Informing and decisioning against risk prioritization and deprioritization. And ultimately, hitting those threat actors in the pocket and working collaboratively with the other agencies. Now, this involves our people, supporting, upskilling, giving a career trajectory to, professionalizing them as intelligencers. We need to align that government strategic vision and ensure that the FIU is central to the nation's efforts in tackling financial crime. And we have to consider, and I'm very conscious of it, of how the consent regime is best used and how it impacts you as the regulated sector. Being an insightful and useful partner, not just in starting investigations, but in helping to inform government the regulator, competent authorities, international counterparts, and industry should all form part of our role. And thinking about how the threat landscape is evolving, financial crime has to be tackled in its entirety. Threat convergence has dramatically changed the threat. The threat actors themselves understand the rules better than we do at times, and they understand the gaps. They work around them. The scale of some state-sponsored or criminal enterprises is astronomical. Science magazine analysis suggests that Mexican cartels are the 5th largest employer in Mexico. And at their height, the Sinaloa cartel was assessed to be wealthier than more than 60 sovereign nations. If we extrapolate that out and think about European mafia, Asian triads, the Yakuza and others, the scale of criminal profit is extreme. The tactic of divide and conquer is a successful approach. But our internal convenience to separate out fraud insight, sanction circumvention, geopolitics, and even cyber matters from financial intelligence can only be beneficial to the threat actors. Threat actors themselves are motivated by huge profits. So removing that profit through asset recovery operations and intelligence that informs that is much more likely to impact them. But how are we going to be set up as a team then to actually engage in those areas and to support that influence? Our FIU branding and meaning is something we are very proud of, and you may have noticed that it comes with a mix of colours. These are the subdivisions. So blue is what most of you will see, which is all about operational matters, the intelligence teams. Gold is the director's office that considers leadership and driving engagement. Green is our careers trajectory and recruitment channel, where we intend to be engaging with schools locally and university leavers in supporting the islanders having a worthwhile, purposeful, and interesting career. And then we have magenta on the training side, specifically a dedicated training channel, which you will start to see in our literature, and you'll be aligned to our training and support that is seen with associations such as the one we've just released with Manchester Compliance, and our new products on knowledge and training for industry and not just for ourselves. I've already mentioned that we need to change our product suite. An operational product and insight will remain blue and help you to be better informed. Typologies relevant to sectors, intelligence insight digests, question and answers, and statistical analysis for use by the industry and others is being developed and will continue. And this has to be delivered by our structure. So to give you some insight, we come as 5 teams now, which comprise the director's office, which covers the leadership matters. Then our tacit team, which is much more about tactical, prioritization, consent. The complex COAT team is about operational analysis, network analysis, and understanding those complex structures that happen here. The strategic intelligence team is much more about network analysis, statistical analysis, and thinking bigger picture, utilizing the data and other nodes to be able to give a much more informed approach. And then we have the ICE team, which is about international collaboration and engagement. We can't do this just by looking inward, and we must be influential on the international stage. We must be conjoined. As an IFC, we are integral to that. The majority of our financial crime is going to be through non-residents. It's going to be through international engagement. And we have to understand and we have to have a position there. So that then means that we have our vision. And this is the FIU's vision, to support the island's position as a leading international finance centre by playing a principal role in the prevention and detection of financial crime and grow into a Tier 1 FIU to best protect Jersey against illicit finance. That, in turn, shapes our mission statement for 2024, which is to deliver our long-term vision by building a sound, independent base and collaborating with local and international partners to provide highly useful and comprehensive intelligence insight, understanding, and opportunities to tackle financial crime threats. Finally, that gives us a picture as to what is going to happen over the next 5 years. This is about growth, and it's about development and understanding. This year is about relaunching and having firm foundations and building on that. Next year is about our training focus, not just for us, but for everybody. After that, a year of international leadership and influence, growing those positions where we can talk about the relevance of an IFC and those parts that are key to us. 2027 is much more about threat convergence, as the threats we know will be converging. Fusion cells, more and better collaborative data and partnerships is important, and aligning threat understanding is key. Ultimately, by 2028, we need to be a principal FIU focused on IFCs. So that's why we are needed, who we are, and the road we intend to follow. But we can't go without others. So it's time to listen to some messages from friends who couldn't join us today, but who have recorded some thoughts and wanted to highlight that for the changing FIU. The first person, John Cusack, has oft quoted the African proverb when thinking about the route we all have to follow. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. I'll hand you over to their video messages.
Thank you, John. Becoming independent is important for an FIU because it means it has the space to form its own view and set its own objectives, of course, in accordance with the country's AML-CTF action plan. The FIU in still too many countries is housed in and under the police umbrella or with the financial supervisor. And whilst these relationships are important, the FIU is really the body, I think, that is best placed to link law enforcement and supervision and the obliged private sector entities together. It's the FIU that sits at the center of all of this, and fighting financial crime, including money laundering and terrorism finance through following the money, cannot achieve success without all the component parts working well. This means the private sector obliged entities preventing, detecting, and reporting, regulators carrying out risk-based focused supervision, and law enforcement carrying out investigations and asset recoveries, all based on a good understanding of the money laundering and terrorism financing risks affecting the country. Each of these essential elements, which are captured in numerous FATF immediate outcomes between 1 to 11, in particular 1, 3, 4, 6, 7, and 8, are the guts of any country's AML-CTF framework. IO6 financial intelligence, including the role of the FIU, interestingly sits right in the middle of the 11 FATF effectiveness criteria, which to me is symbolic in that its importance is of itself, but also central to the effectiveness of all the elements. I wish the Jersey FIU and you, John, the very best in your endeavors to come, and also an excellent conference. Thank you.
Dear colleagues, I am Elżbieta Franków-Jaśkiewicz, the interim chair of the Egmont Group of Financial Intelligence Units, deputy director of the Department of Financial Information of the Polish Ministry of Finance, Polish FIU, the General Inspector of Financial Information. I am delighted to join this event organized by FIU-Jersey. I sincerely congratulate the management and the entire team of FIU-Jersey on the launch of its successful anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing activities under the new FIU structure. I think that the changes that have been introduced over the past year will have a significant impact on building cooperation in this area at the national level with law enforcement agencies, obliged institutions, and supervisors, and in particular will have an impact on building public-private partnerships in the AML-CFT area and at the international level as well. A successful FIU requires a high level of commitment from its government to ensure sufficient budgetary resources are available to FIUs to achieve their objectives, as well as having operational independence and autonomy. Saying this, I wish you a successful event. I thank you for your attention.
Hi, Jonathan. Thanks for the opportunity to join you at the relaunch of the FIU. I'm so sorry I can't be with you today. We're delighted that the FIU is becoming independent, and our members look forward to working with you. From the Wolfsburg Group's perspective, here are some things we'd love for you to keep top of mind and that we think will help improve our joint effectiveness. Work with your government colleagues to set priorities and share them with the regulated sector so that we can help you achieve those objectives. If we're allowed to align our output with your priorities, then maybe we can take a bigger bite out of crime together. More, especially in relation to SARS, is not necessarily better. More clogs your FIU with information that might be useful one day. Better are those SARs aligned to your objectives that enable law enforcement to take down the criminals sooner rather than later. Develop an environment where feedback and collaboration with the regulated sector is second nature. Collaboration with the regulated sector builds a new type of network, and as the FATF president says, it takes a network to beat a network. Please focus on effectiveness and outcomes to guide your development and how you approach the regulated sector. It's not about the form. It's about the impact that the information has. Look for ways to enhance information sharing between the public sector and the private sector and within the private sector. This allows identification of networks that none of us can find on our own, and it leads to better outcomes for all of us. All of our resources are finite. Agreeing on a shift of those resources to higher value activities means we both get better value for money and keep society safer. Lastly, keep in mind that a risk-based approach is not a zero-tolerance exercise, and that it means both doing more for higher risk activities, but also less in lower risk areas. Thank you once again. Goodbye and good luck.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Evans, and I used to be the head of the British Security Service, MI5, and for some years I was on the board of HSBC, looking particularly at financial crime risk. So it's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to congratulate the Jersey Financial Intelligence Unit on your new relaunch. This will be an opportunity, I know, to focus on intelligence and particularly to build that big and strategic intelligence understanding, which means that interventions can be targeted and they go beyond individual arrests to have a strategic impact. I also am sure that you will be working very closely with other organizations in collaboration, not just in the UK, but also internationally. International crime groups operate without any due respect for borders, and it's important that our response should do the same. And I look forward to seeing the progress that you make in coming years.
Good. Well, some powerful messages there from 4 of my old bosses. I think in particular, John Cusack and Elżbieta on the importance and criticality of an FIU across that national system resonates. And as Lord Evans highlighted, intelligence is the critical enabler, providing insight and decision opportunity across financial crime. And ultimately, that's what demonstrates effect. Of course, we need to keep delivering the tactical opportunities for others, but we must grow strategic insight and influence and help numerous stakeholders to be better informed and better prepared. This is about being proactive, not just reactive. So the international nature of illicit finance and use and abuse of different countries, sectors and products makes this threat incredibly complex to understand. And it is only through partnerships and collaboration that we can hope to tackle it. To me, the FIU holds three critical relationships: international FIUs, the regulated sector, and domestic competent authorities. Elżbieta from the Egmont Group highlighted that 170 FIUs engage either directly or through the Egmont Group of FIUs, through a formal intelligence sharing gateway. And that is a truly powerful collaboration. I'd like to invite our first panel up onto the stage to consider that international FIU to FIU engagement. I think I'll probably call it an estimation of FIUs, as it's collective noun. First off, Toms Platisis, head of the FIU Latvia, Ewan McKeeve, senior manager from operations at the UK FIU, and Edgar Lopez, director of FIU Gibraltar and chair of the Quad Island Group of FIUs. So, gents, thanks very much for joining me. Just going down the line, it would be useful just if you can briefly describe your national FIU. Is it an administrative or a law enforcement model? Does it have a primarily domestic or international focus? And how big is it? How many sort of staff is it? Edgar?
I'll start off. The Gibraltar FIU is a very small FIU. I think it's one of the smallest in the Egmont Group. We are a total of 12 officers. We're administrative FIU, and we fall under the Ministry of Justice for budgetary and administrative purposes. But we deal with a large volume of SARS in comparison to other jurisdictions of similar-sized international finance centres, and our focus is on domestic and international cases. And last year, just to give you an example, last year we received just under 5,000 SARS plus thousands of pieces of other parts of financial intelligence from other sources. But we have some very good analysis software and some very good IT systems in place to deal with that.
Tom.
Good morning. FIU Latvia, you probably heard the country. We're working for an IFC. We used to be a regional financial center until 2018, and then we completely turned the country around, and that's when I joined FIU, not prior to 2018. We used to be, our story is quite similar as the Jersey FIU. We used to be a small part of a Prosecutor General's team, and that's when financial crime is not a priority, you put the FIU in something or in somewhere. And as of 2019, we are fully autonomous FIU under the Prime Minister of Latvia, and we're almost 90 people this year. 72 engaged in the prime business or core business of FIU, and now extra 19 supervising and enforcing sanctions in Latvia as of this year. As most of the FIUs were involved in both national and international, we're still dealing with the past mistakes of being a regional financial center and not having strong enough supervisors and FIU, but mostly focused on local predicates, national security and EU security when it comes to sanctions.
Thanks, Thomas. You.
Thanks, Jonathan. Good morning. My name's Ewan McKeeve, and the UK FIU is a hybrid model. We sit under a law enforcement umbrella, which is the National Crime Agency, but we have very distinct roles separate from them. We don't have investigative powers. Our officers are intelligence officers, but through our consent regime, for example, we can trigger investigations under both money laundering and terrorist financing. In the last 5 years, our teams have triggered investigations that have led to the recovery of almost £1 billion of criminal proceeds of crime. So we are able to trigger investigations. Our focus is both domestic and international. We have some challenges in our international engagement in terms of resource and our compliance and being able to operate at massive scale. And to give you an example, when we started a journey of SARS reform and transformation, in 2019, we were working on the basis that we were receiving 350,000 SARS a year. They stay in our database for 6 years. Last year, we received 950,000 SARs. Our database currently sits at 4.3 million SARs as we speak. We've moved from 81 officers in 2018-2019 at the time of our last review. We are now currently sitting at 172 intelligence officers and officers across the UK FIU performing both operational intelligence developments and the backroom analysis. And we have also, I beg your pardon, sorry. Yeah, our ambition is to have 220 staff in place by the end of 2024. Thank you.
Excellent. I think it just demonstrates that sort of broad spread. No one FIU is the same as another. No threat landscape is the same as another. No reporting requirement and therefore sort of business and economic setup is the same as another. But we're all seeking to do the same thing. Edgar, just sort of starting with you, the US, I think, recognized a year or two ago that FinCEN should, or Director FinCEN, their FIU, should be a member of the National Security Council because of the importance, the strategic importance of financial crime and tackling it, and being an intelligence agency and aligning with the other national intelligence agencies. Do you think that FIUs get that right recognition, or are they seen as just a sort of receipt and repository center?
I think that most FIUs, from perhaps a historical and traditional practice, has been that FIUs have worked secretly in the background, and perhaps they haven't had the recognition that their counterparts in larger national intelligence agencies have received. But I think there's been a shift in focus from both Egmont and indeed the FATF, and we've heard from some of the introductions before, the focus by the FATF on the FIUs and its standards, and its recognizing it through the recommendations, and that the FIUs touch upon almost all, if not all, immediate outcomes, which are the measures or the standards that measure the effectiveness of a country's response to tackling money laundering and terrorist financing and proliferation financing. And therefore, there is some focus now on the FIUs, and I think we've had a significant shift towards raising the profile of an FIU. And I think it's down to leaders. I think even the 4 jurisdictions just on this panel, we are very active on social media. We use other media platforms. You've got some very nice animation and graphics there, just raising the profile of what the FIU does so that people understand. And that includes governments, ministers, heads of departments, our counterparts in law enforcement. I used to come from I've got a police background. When I joined the FIU as a conduit to the FIU, I had no idea what the FIU did, heard about them, didn't know what they actually did. And I think that, it takes leaders like us to make that change the perception of what the FIU does, and hopefully get some recognition in the future and bring it up to the level of a national intelligence agency.
Excellent, thanks. Toms, Latvia have changed their model recently, and you've had a lot of upskilling, a lot of growth and investment in technology. Can you sort of give us an indication of that digital transformation journey and what benefits you've either seen or you're hoping to see as a result?
Thank you, Jenton. Yes, as I said, we've tripled our size. Our budget has, I think, increased by 5 times. 70% of our budget is IT development, and has been for the last few years. Minus the salaries. If somebody Googles minus the salaries, everything you can spend. And of course, there's a lot of benefits. One of my favorite colleagues, head of Dutch FIU, Henny, when she applied for her government for extra funding, and they said, take more personnel. She said, I don't need 100 people. I need 1 person in IT, because if you need one good case, 1,000 people won't do it. You need IT, and 1 person is enough. So we see big benefit in IT development, And it's very fruitful, and you can automate the easiest tasks and employ higher level people and use their intelligence or for developing intelligence. And coming back a little bit to your previous question, FIUs being branded or looking for the strategic place as a part of the security agencies in the country, as the US is trying, or as you mentioned in the slide, being the only security agency in the country. That's what my focus is, but it's a very tough focus. We have two and a half, let's say, different, plus the FIU, different security agencies, and they're very secretive. But the FIU has to be very open about many, many things, maybe not the operational part of things, but branding, PR, recruiting people that banking sector tries to steal from you, or TCSPs, or many more. So you have to be open, you have to engage with obliged entities, you have to teach them what you know and share as much as possible, and it's a very tough place to be for the FIUs. But at the same time, the main role of the FIU is to focus the country's financial intelligence efforts or combating financial crime efforts to the right place. Because the police, at least in many countries, they have the mandatory principle of investigation, so they have to investigate everything, but the FIU can focus on what's more important, risk-based approach essentially, and that's the role of FIU. That's why it's smart to have the FIU as a standalone authority that focuses the whole country's efforts to fight the more important and more significant crimes.
Excellent, thanks. So just sort of picking up on that, Ewan, there has been a drive to move FIUs out of law enforcement and into administrative models, but of course the UK FIU sits sort of within the National Crime Agency. Do you think there's ever going to be a position when the UK becomes, or the UK FIU becomes an administrative model?
Yeah, I think, as you say, Jonathan, we're a hybrid model currently. What I should say is that we operate, what we would say, autonomously and independently to the extent that our officers are designated under the Crime and Courts Act. That gives officers within the UK FIU specific powers in relation to decision-making that affects SARS or SAR reporting, whether to withhold or grant consent. And of course, maybe looking at the wider relationship with the National Economic Crime Centre, which leads on directing and influencing Economic Crime Plan 2, for example, strategic stakeholder engagement, then we're able to draw from the plans of different parts within the organisation, within government, put them into our own strategic action plans, set our own objectives, set our own targets, and make those decisions independently. So I think it's a really, really important thing that we're able to do. Behind that, we're also introducing, very important thing you touched on earlier was around career pathways. So actually having the right type of people doing the right type of job. We're now engaged in developing what we call iLearn sessions, and before you become an accredited officer working with intelligence within the UK FIU, you'll have met a national standard and you will have completed a number of courses, and then there's that ongoing CPD development that goes on a 6-monthly basis. So being part of the NEC and being part of the NCA means that we're actually able to leverage and use our partners appropriately. Thank you.
Interesting. So if we think about sort of FIUs and how effective they are, Toms, is it a fair reflection that I think there are 3, if we remove sort of Russia, there are 3 FIUs judged by FATF standards to be highly effective: Spain, the Netherlands, and Israel. Latvia, of course, are just about to have their next sort of round of money val assessments in the 5th round, 6th round. Are you going for a high, and do you think that that's sort of achievable? And do all FIUs need to be sort of driving and pushing for that standard?
Yes.
Okay.
But yes, as you said, there's only 4 FIUs in the world that have been assessed as high effectiveness. So for those who don't know, but at this point of time you probably all know, there's 4 ratings for effectiveness in the FATF standards, basically 1 to 4, 1 to failing ratings, 3, 4 passing ratings, and only 4 countries, including Russia, have managed to get high. So 3 countries, as you said, Spain, it's a very outdated report. It's 2014, so I would not talk about that much. But Israel and the Netherlands, they're both more recent, especially Netherlands, and those two countries have achieved high. And it's very interesting because they're one of the few countries, or two of the few countries, that don't have the STR reporting regime. They have a UTR reporting, basically threshold reporting. And then what the FIU does is they build STRs, and they report STRs to the police instead of receiving STRs and then disseminating intelligence reports, as most of the FIUs do. And those are the two FIUs having high effectiveness. We have an STR regime, so we would be one of the first ones, hopefully, to get a high rating. But it is sad to see that many FIUs fail. I've been assessor for a few countries myself, and I see disastrous FIUs around the world and in Europe. And as my mentor always says, the FATF is the minimum standard. And nobody has achieved high effectiveness on the minimum standard. So it is a sad picture, but not all FIUs have to be equal. Not all FIUs have to be amazing and well-staffed. If it's a very local economy, as you are not one, just to emphasize, the FIUs can be smaller, and if the police can manage everything and all the local risks, that makes sense, and that could be the case. But for international financial centers, a strong and autonomous FIU is a must.
Yeah, and of course we wish you well for your assessment, and we've got high hopes for you, most definitely, having seen sort of the plans and the models and the implementation that you've done. You're certainly a model to look up to. Ewan, just sort of going back to you, we're thinking here a little bit, I suppose, about those responsibilities of FIUs. And of course, in the UK, the Metropolitan Police Service have counter-terrorism responsibilities, and you've got the NTFIU, which I think Casey is in the audience somewhere, and yet the UK FIU still has to receive and engage with sort of terrorist financing related SARS. How does this work in reality? Because you're cutting across different organisations, different responsibilities, and different areas. Does it work successfully, or would you prefer to own it, accepting that Casey's in the room and he might go back to
well, I think because it's my team and I work with Casey closely, I hope you'd agree that it does work fairly successfully. Our roles, however, are distinctly different, but we're very much aligned. So we have a statutory obligation in law under the Terrorism Act to deal with defence against terrorist financing requests and terrorism SARS or STRs. In reality, our terrorist finance team is also an engagement team, so we will work across HNG and counter-terrorist policing. We have an embedded officer from the NTFIU who works with us. It's more of a point of contact, a conduit. So if we had a terrorist incident, not just in the UK or internationally, we would be able to respond and start to build a financial intelligence picture behind that and help our law enforcement colleagues. So our working relationships are really excellent. We will have a lot of collaborative thinking. An example of something that we're recently doing, and this was FIU instigated, is the hotspotting of terrorist SAR reporting and looking at different areas across the UK, perhaps where we're seeing an upsurge in terrorist SARS. Asking the big question is what's happening there and what can we do to help improve or inform the UK's contest strategy. So is there something there that can be done in the prevent space rather than actually being reactive? So that's one of the projects that we're working on in the moment, to the extent that I can say. But collaboration with our colleagues across counter-terrorist policing, I would say, is the thing that works really, really well.
Good. And I suppose sort of staying on that collaborative theme, going back to you, Edgar, of course you chair at the moment the Quad Island Group of Financial Intelligence Units that comprises Gibraltar, Jersey, Guernsey and the Isle of Man. It seeks to share best practice between sort of FIUs of a similar size and approach. Is this a model that can expand and grow? Is it successful, sort of in your terms, under your leadership?
Well, firstly, I'm really happy that I'm handing over tomorrow the chair to you. I've been doing that for almost 2 years now, and it's been quite challenging, so good luck with that one.
Thank you. I like a challenge, yeah.
So, look, the Quad Island Forum is really an incredibly useful forum between the Crown dependencies and Gibraltar. And I think, you know, even a number of years ago when I was in Brighton, it was then called the Tri-Island Forum. It quickly changed to a Quad Island because we saw the value of having Gibraltar added in there. But the Quad Island is not an intelligence sharing working group. We've got Egmont for that. We've got other systems in place and other platforms that we use to share financial intelligence and sensitive information. But what it is, it's a group of individuals that come together. We share very similar legislation. We share very similar software, IT solutions. We've got very similar challenges. And therefore, you know, just having a group of individuals who share a common interest is going to bring you some positive results. And we've seen some very positive outcomes from the FIU over the last few years because it gives us an enhanced picture of what's happening in terms of the threat picture, the challenges that we face as international finance centers, financial centers, and therefore, you know, it has immense value. And the point that you've made about whether other jurisdictions should be looking out for replicating the model. I think we've already had some very keen interest from other jurisdictions, including our colleagues from the overseas territories in the Caribbean. They want to replicate that. And looking at the legislation, whether, obviously it makes it easier for us because we've got very similar legislation. Obviously, we've got a common language that we use, and we can collaborate a lot easier. But it doesn't stop other jurisdictions, regional jurisdictions, to create a forum like this because, like I said, it's got some immense value. And it's, the Quad Island perhaps over the last 4 or 5 years has become almost like a family, an extended family, because we meet up, we discuss, and it's not just about discussing all the issues about, the threats that we face, but it's also about internal challenges that we face within specific FIUs, and we can share that. It's almost sometimes like a venting session, so it's got its health benefits. So yeah, it is really, really useful for a forum like this to be replicated in other jurisdictions.
Yeah. I think it's always worth remembering, isn't it, that FinCrime, financial crime, is not a competitive space. It's something that we all have to grow and learn from, whether you're sort of on our side or you're in the regulated sector. It's about tackling the criminals, not trying to make some competitive advantage.
And it's also about the work streams that have come out from the discussions that we had in the main Quad FIU forum. We've enhanced our relationship with the economic crime units. We're now exploring our relationship with the tax authorities. We've got a terrorist financing workshop or subgroup. We've got a strategic analysis subgroup, public-private partnership, and we're now looking at advanced technologies as well as a separate subgroup. So, it's just gone from strength to strength over the last few years.
Great. And then just sort of final question, and just briefly, I suppose, back to you, Toms, because you've got a slightly different model, and you take broader responsibilities. As you sort of mentioned, you're taking sanctions responsibility, you do sort of national risk assessments, and you've got a larger capability. Do you think that's sort of the right direction of travel for others? I know accepting that everybody has to have something that is suitable for their jurisdiction, but bringing all of those areas of illicit finance together rather than singularly trying to look down the sort of the barrel of the AML gun and ignoring the sanctions and geopolitics and fraud and other pieces.
Very much depends on the country and what's the situation in that country. In our case, bringing sanctions under the FIU was the only rational decision. There wasn't really another authority that had the competences and the knowledge and the competitive salaries to attract those people from the private sector other than the FIU. In other countries, it might not be the FIU. At least in EU, there are few countries that have FIUs as competent authorities when it comes to sanctions enforcement and compliance. So not necessarily. When it comes to other functions, NRA, I think it fits perfectly under the FIU. I never imagined a different model, and then when I traveled some of the countries seeing that ministries of finance are the competent authorities in NRA, I was quite surprised because you're the intelligence. You're the smartest, most knowledgeable institution in the country when it comes to anti-financial crime. So I think it's obvious that FIU should lead national risk assessments. We have a dedicated function, which is strategic analysis, which is basically essentially the same thing. Drafting typologies, assessing risks, or drafting up the national risk assessment makes sense. Other FIUs are also supervisors for DNFBPs or also financial sectors. I think that also is a good approach in many countries, but not necessarily all. But I believe that if gathering those functions makes FIU stronger, and it usually does, then it makes sense, and that's the right way to continue.
Excellent. Well, we'll take that in mind. So thank you very much, gentlemen. If I can take you back to your seats now.
Thank you.
So we've just sort of heard there, collaboration is critical and partnerships are essential if we are to tackle financial crime better. That intersection and interaction between public and private sectors is one of the keys to unlocking and linking those singular pieces of the puzzle that we individually see. Financial crime public-private partnerships started with GIMLET 10 years ago, and it has grown to be internationally acclaimed and a recommended requirement by the likes of the Egmont Group and supported by the Financial Action Task Force, think tanks, and other collaborations. The models can and do differ, but success is generally enabled by certain approaches. We need to be clear on the objectives. We need to understand the aims of each participant and collaborate to inform, support, and better identify or disrupt activity. Without trust and a willingness to share, there will be no success. It's a collective approach. Disagreements should not stop action. We start small, we learn, we adapt, and we grow. And we need to collect relevant and effectiveness MI for all partners because we have to show the benefit to others. Work within your legal boundaries and privacy boundaries. And future thinking, do not be static. The landscape is forever changing. Seniority and motivation have to drive that engagement. There has to be seen to be clear benefit. And lastly, we need to grow into different sectors. The banking sector have been great in this world, but other sectors need to become motivated and involved as well. So for ourselves, during 2023, we revitalized our relationship with GIMLET, using that forum to do some really significant bank to 3 FIU and a foreign law enforcement collaboration. This was because we were trusted, we were engaged, and we had a relationship. It wasn't because we just asked them to do it. We joined EFIP, the Europol Financial Intelligence Public-Private Partnership, which has been particularly beneficial as we work with other partners, banks and law enforcement and FIUs on specific global cases or on strategic insight to immediate threats, including promoting IFC understanding of terrorist financing threats post-October 2023 and the Israel and Hamas situation. And we were welcomed by both the United for Wildlife and the Global Coalition to Fight Financial Crime, two globally, internationally significant and important groups offering new insights on illegal wildlife crime and broader global issues. We represent all of these as an IFC because that position of IFCs in the activity chain is often overlooked by large countries with a domestic focus. The benefits of these groups is that they give us useful, informed, and shareable product, and we can impart and inform on that as well. But I do sometimes see that there is limited benefit in just forwarding on some of this product. We as the FIU need to look at it and assess it and consider the so what to Jersey. What is its relevance to us and what is its relevance to an IFC? If we can bottle that, then it's relevant to you rather than just giving you yet another document that we say somebody, a different jurisdiction, believes these are red flags and this is important. We need to make it relevant for ourselves. But if we do that, then that product and output, if actioned, can improve effectiveness. So what about Jersey? Well, we're delighted that this year we have been busy creating our own public-private partnership, the Jersey Financial Intelligence Network, JFIN for short. It's been delivered essentially since last April, where we convened the first meeting, and we've had 6 or 7 meetings since then. And today we are delighted to formally launch it with all of the members present. So a massive thank you to Lloyds Bank International, to Santander, to Barclays Bank, to HSBC, and to RBSI International. This is our first collaboration. All of these people, including ourselves and the government of Jersey, have been open, collaborative, and want to engage and share. We started with the banking sector to test and adjust and understand. We commenced as a strategic group, and now we are empowered to deliver both operational and strategic insight. And we continue to build on that core model. But to make it work, you have to give to get, and I'm sure Donald will repeat that later. This isn't a one-way street. Everyone has to engage and have the data and desire to share. We need drivers on this journey, not just passengers. The first year has been building the key enablers, mutual understanding, and that critical element of trust. During the year, some strategic project focuses have been rolled out to test approaches and to test NRA findings. In particular, we reviewed and assessed the threat of modern slavery and human trafficking as it relates to Jersey. And more recently, we've been undertaking a collaborative exercise on understanding the use, misuse, and vulnerabilities of Jersey banknotes. But this is a start for us, and we have to start small and learn quickly to make it sustainable. We also want to expand into other sectors and drive better collaboration and a mutual understanding for all. So, if you're interested and believe and can see the benefit, then engage with us. Around the world, banks have understood and want to engage, but it's now up to other sectors, new sectors, the trust sector, funds, legal, accountancy, the virtual asset and crypto space. The benefit is that you get relevant and tailored insight. We listen, we understand, we engage, and we collaborate better. That collective understanding means that we can be collective and strong partners together in this fight. But if we don't understand your challenges, we can't help or we miscommunicate, and it's not beneficial. Of course, there is also JFIN literature, and we're building out our output and making that available to all within the sector and anybody that seems and deems it relevant. This isn't just a selective club. This is about trying to help everybody. So this is about trying to think about different products, trying to develop them, and then considering collectively the so what to Jersey and the so what to an IFC. We are getting a new website, and we do have new comms channels, which will all be coming. One caveat, though, which is my expectation, that having the freedom to operate comes with the responsibility to cooperate, and that becomes a critical. Anyway, enough from me. I'd like to invite a stellar group of public-private partnership experts to join me. Leaving aside Chris, we'll probably call this a wealth of bankers. And this includes Donald Toon, the former National Crime Agency Director of Prosperity Command and public-private partnership champion, now an executive head with NatWest Group. Nick Kinnear, the RBSI head of compliance here in Jersey, and RBSI being the co-chair of the JFIN. And Chris Bostock, another ex-National Crime Agency and Gimlet lead, now a global influencer with Deloitte as their public-private partnership and financial crime lead. gentleman. Excellent. So I mentioned sort of you in passing at the very beginning, Donald, this sort of objective you've got to give to get. Can you sort of talk us through some of the benefits of public-private partnership from a bank perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. There's a lot, I think, to be gained from public-private partnership. From bank perspective, from an enforcement and regulatory perspective, and from a national public policy perspective. One of the issues for us, of course, from a banking angle is a sense that all too often what we're actually doing is spending a very significant amount of effort in highly untargeted activity. We have law, regulation, and a range of processes that we are required to undertake. We know, and colleagues in law enforcement are often equally clear, that a very significant proportion of what we're doing is of minimal value from an enforcement or regulatory perspective, very limited impact on criminality, and yet is a drain on the capacity and capability of the private sector. What we've been really clear about is the need to move to a far better informed, far more proactive piece of work, which enables us to do the collaboration on high-risk activity, to spend time and effort really focusing on understanding networks, on identifying what is happening across the industry, not simply looking through the tiny little letterbox that we can see of our own behaviors in customers, but looking at what is actually manifesting itself right across industry. What does that tell us about the ability to strengthen and tighten the relevant systems and controls that we have in place to actually impact on the threat and minimize the impact on the honest customer? And that's a big issue for us, of course, which is about, from a UK perspective, getting a real balance of effect and impact between managing financial crime risk and consumer duty, getting the good outcome for those customers who may be affected by poorly, less effectively targeted systems and controls and understanding of risk. So there's a real benefit from our perspective. I would say one quick thing, just to finish off on that. So public-private partnership absolutely is give to get. It's give information from the public sector, give advice from the public sector, give direction of travel from the public sector to get quality intelligence, quality understanding, and impact on the threat. Always remembering that while investigation and prosecution is a key output of tackling financial crime, it is not the outcome. The outcome is less financial crime impacting the jurisdiction that you're operating in and worldwide. That outcome is delivered at least as much through prevention and protection of activity as through, just sticking with the usual 4P approach in the UK, as well as the pursue that targets criminality. That's how you make the system safer and make it safer and more effective for everyone, as opposed to obsessing about one particular output.
Great, thank you, Donald. Chris, I think you and perhaps Nigel Kirby came up with the phrase "dare to share," another sort of great analogy. And since then you've been engaged a lot with sort of Deloitte on the international stage about public-private partnerships. What are the key lessons that you've learned over the last sort of few years about both the need, the delivery, and the blockers?
Thank you, Jonathan. So yeah, the dare to share, I think actually, as I've travelled around the world and spoken to people over the years, is actually, I'm not sure I'd go with that anymore. I think actually you do need a really clear legal gateway in order to give the trust to engage. I think a better phrase, which is another phrase that Nigel and Donald and I used, was that you should share as much as possible, not as little as is required. And I think that actually speaks fundamentally to the change that you're trying to achieve in public-private partnership around getting genuine collaboration, genuinely bringing different sectors together to tackle a shared problem. But having sort of corrected that initial mismessaging, I think there are some common building blocks which I saw in the UK and which I've seen replicated in public-private partnerships that work well around the world. Governance is fundamental, and within that is the purpose of the public-private partnership and what it is you're trying to achieve. That can include what you're prioritising, but it could also include the kind of sharing you're aspiring towards as well. Are you only sharing typological data? Are you sharing operational tactical information as well? That then comes onto the clear legal gateway. We were very lucky in the UK to have the Section 7 gateway of the Crime and Courts Act, which was very permissive and very flexible in the way that operational information could be shared, but it was only functional within a wider set of governance. That was without that governance to build the trust around the legal gateway, I don't think it would have worked. There would also be some other tensions that always come up in every public-private partnership I've seen. One is around privacy, how you manage the conflict between information sharing and privacy. So that's always one that needs to be thought through. Competition risk obviously needs to be thought through. You had on your screen there the 5 banks who are participating. There will be other institutions saying, oh, wait a minute, what's going on in there, and why can't I participate? And I think your piece around typologies is fundamental there, making sure that you're gathering that information and sharing it to the wider sectors so that everybody benefits is one of the great arguments against that competition piece. De-risking, your operational colleagues in law enforcement will be saying, well, wait a minute, if I share this information, am I going to lose my access to that insight? So managing de-risking is key, and governance, and actually also managing the intersection between the public-private partnership and the reporting of suspicion is key as well. That's another one that always trips up. But the governance is key, therefore, to deal with those issues. But if you get that governance right, that gives you the foundation to build the trust that you need between the partners to engage in a new way of working. And every time you're asking people to engage in a new way of working, you have to have that trust in there. And then perhaps the sort of final point I would make is around making it real. I lost count of the number of meetings we were in back in, I guess, 2013, 2014, when GIMLIT was first sort of being thought through, where we were going through process charts and conceptual information flows, and everyone was sat in rooms, and just actually nothing was progressing. And it was only when case number 1 was put on the table, and we said, right, there it is. What are you going to do with it? That forced the banks in the room to say, gosh, how are we going to deal with the Section 7 gateway? How are we going to respond to the NCA? And getting that first case on the table, getting that first pilot up and running to force through the issues in practice rather than in theory is absolutely fundamental to any PPP as it grows.
Yeah, no, thanks, Chris. It sort of leads to a point, I suppose, Nick, if you can pick this one up, that, and I alluded to it, that trust, of course, is critical, but also the seniority of people that engage. I think we learned in GIMLIT that if you had senior people in the room, they could drive action, they could make decisions there and then, and they could actually empower the place. We didn't want this to become like a posting box where information was put in that then had to be taken away. It stopped that conversation and it stopped that ability to have a purpose. But of course, if we want senior people to be there, that comes at a cost. You are businesses, after all, and dropping in senior people constantly just into a talking shop isn't an effective way. There must be sort of action that is driven out of it. So sort of what is that sort of motivation and that one of those drivers that you see in relation to keeping that seniority and keeping that momentum going?
I think it's a really good point. I think for me, when I step back, and this is the ethical point around this anyway, right? It's the right thing to do. But that only gets you so far. And I think one of the challenges that we potentially face with this is if you look at the island in the lead up to Moneyval, everyone has spent a lot on this. Financial crime has been on everyone's lips, and I can guarantee that a lot of the board, while they see it as important, probably want to get on to other things. So to go to the people holding the purse strings and say, here's another thing to spend money on, what we're going to have to do is very quickly, to Chris's point, show the output and show the value and show why this makes a difference, and to Donald's point, how this allows us to work smarter, to cut some of the noise out, to reduce some of that false positive things that we're looking at, to really target on the things that make a difference to strengthen what we're doing as an island. And that, to me, starts to create an opportunity to create this kind of perpetual motion around it, and we can really see why we're doing this. Because we spend so much money on doing this, and I've described this before, as I can sit there in the dark and try and do a jigsaw. That's kind of what I'm doing a lot of the time at the moment. Well, I can switch the lights on where I see typologies coming out from the FIU. But if we all do this together, it's the equivalent of giving me the box of the thing I'm trying to make the jigsaw picture of, and I can actually get that done. And you know, I think that to me is the key. We've got to be setting the reasonable measures, fairly stretching but reasonable measures that we can achieve pretty quickly to show the value. And that allows us through the government interaction, the regulatory interaction, the FIU, law enforcement and the regulated sector to actually genuinely have that conversation that says, right, we're doing this, we see this, what matters, let's focus on this. Do we have to do things, but do we have to spend as much on that? Because this is going to move the dial.
Yeah. I think Jersey are probably lucky because we've only, unlike the UK that's got sort of thousands of banks, we've only got sort of a dozen or more. So therefore we can keep it small. One of the lessons, again, that I picked up with being in Gimlet in the early days was small is often better. I'm not so sure that now it's 30-odd banks that you can have the same type of collaboration around the table and that everybody is involved in the same type of sort of thought process. Donald, have you got some views on that?
Yeah, I think Chris put it well. I mean, governance is absolutely key to a lot of this. So things have moved on. We're still talking about Gimlet. You'll see a lot of work we do now is Barrister's Gimlet Plus. But around that, you've got a United Kingdom economic crime plan. You've got very clear objectives in that economic crime plan, which are around prioritization. You had it on your own bullet points, Jonathan, being really clear. What are the national priorities that apply to everyone? And how are they delivered by everyone? And that means the law enforcement, regulator, government, so from a UK perspective, certainly both the Home Office and the Treasury, but also other government bodies like the Tax Authority, like the Benefits Authority. How do we actually make sure those are all delivered as consistent priorities for everyone? And how do we actually give effect to those priorities, as Nick suggested? There are certain things that we should be spending much more time and effort on. There are others that we could safely deprioritize. And what does prioritization mean? And this is a conversation we're working through at the moment under the economic crime plan in the UK. It's what are the priorities and how do you qualify? So our argument so far has been, I think we're agreed, public-private, that prioritization has to mean that you can deliver a substantive, measurable reduction in that problem in a defined timetable, and that has to be sustainable. And so you aim to hit the priority issue and target and drive down that and then move on to other issues. All of that is really hard work. It's hard work, particularly when you've got organizations who, to an extent, have nervousness around each other's priorities, around each other's business models, who really are required to have trust, and you've got a lot of organizations potentially in the room. And one of the things that's been really important, I think, from a UK angle has been, so there's 1,000 payment service providers in the UK. You can't play with everybody. You can't expect everybody to have the same level of agreement, of prioritization, et cetera, on everything. So you have to be a bit selective. And it has to be, you have to create coalition of the willing, and you have to be prepared to do things slightly differently with those who are working together but have a clear framework for those who don't wish to engage. And that's quite a difficult concept. And I would say one thing on all of this, which is you've got to have the controlling players in that debate, and you've got to have them all signed up. One of the things that we did from the start of GMLIT was make sure that Financial Conduct Authority was in the room, was engaged, everything was transparent. We have a Public-Private Operations Board in the UK now, the regulator, the Home Office, the Treasury, law enforcement, all on that board, as well as the broader private sector. You've got to have that consistency of message. If you don't, you might as well pack up and go home and just go back to doing it on a straightforward, we'll report what we find basis.
Yeah, absolutely, Nick.
And Donald's absolutely right, but this is what I think is so exciting about this as an opportunity for Jersey, because if you look around this room, everyone is here. The government is here, the regulator is here, all the industries are represented here. You try and do this in the UK, and yes, you've got 1,000 payment providers, you've got umpteen banks, try and get everyone together, even on the promise of lovely pastries is not going to do it, right? But what we've got an opportunity here is a room here covering everyone that is a coalition of willing. You know, now's the opportunity for us, and I think that creates such an exciting opportunity to reach your ambition of that premier FIU. Why not? Because we punch way above our weight as an island, Jersey PLC itself. Why can't we do it in this space? And I think the motivation is there at the moment.
Yeah, no, definitely. But why? People might say, we've got the Jersey Banking sort of Association, we've got the JCOA, we've got numerous sort of collaborative groups where these people talk. Why isn't that sort of good enough? Why do you need to sort of create yet another group?
I mean, my view is it serves a very specific purpose, right? You know, we get together at the JBA and the Financial Crime and Conduct Forum, and we talk about certain things. The things that we would be able to talk about and the things we should be talking about within the conference of JFIN are not the things we should be talking about around that table. And I think it's about that clear structure of what the purpose is. These things should all dovetail together, and from an industry perspective, should do and come together. But the construct we have in the public-private allows us to do very targeted, specific, intelligence-led things that shouldn't be within these other areas.
Okay. So sort of two more questions, I think sort of one to Chris and perhaps one to Donald. Chris, starting off with yours, you've been on both the public and the private sector side. This is talking about public-private partnerships, but of course, private and private sector sharing, public and public sector sharing, sort of the outcomes, the focus just on a singular sector here with banks, which is predominantly what is happening around, and disseminating information. Sort of, what are your views on those sort of big gaps that still remain?
So the private to private is absolutely fundamental. I think the thing that always struck me as almost at the heart of public-private partnership and why public-private partnership is so important is that you've got a limited amount of capacity in the system, in the public sector and in the private sector. You have vastly more capacity in the private sector. If you can't get that capacity from an FIU perspective, from a policing perspective, working effectively against the threat, then you're missing a huge opportunity. And just to give you a sense of that scale, I remember having a conversation with, I won't say which bank it was, but it was one bank in the UK that had over 6,000 people working in their financial crime team. Now, bear in mind, the National Crime Agency only has like 4,500 people in its entirety. So they've got 6,000 people in one bank working in financial crime. 3,000 of those people working in transaction monitoring, alert sort of management, of which 97% were false positives. So you've got 3,000 people spending 97% of their time not finding financial crime. Now, that is a staggeringly big army that you can turn towards fighting financial crime if you can get the right information into the hands of the right people so they can turn that power to everybody's benefit. So there's a clear benefit to both sides. But there is absolutely right, on the private to private side, that hasn't been explored far enough. There's an interesting pilot which potentially will go live quite soon in the UK, which is exploring, could you share financial crime exit data, for example, between banks? That's just the very first step, potentially, on that private-to-private sharing to make sure that that collaborative insight is brought together to improve the quality of SARs that go into the FIU, to make them more actionable, make them more making better, sort of, recovering assets, for example, as well. But I think there is also a question around public-to-public sharing as well. It's not good enough yet, I don't think, in any jurisdiction I've been to. There's places that do it better, places that do it worse, but there's very few places that genuinely link up everything the public sector knows about criminal threats in such a way that it can engage meaningfully with the private sector and ensure that the private sector knows everything that it knows collectively about around the threat as well. So I think PPP is stage one. What we've seen around the world is, even 10 years later in Gimlet, it's still kind of relative baby steps. There's not really been digitization. There's not really been that kind of fundamental scaling up. But the fundamental value has been shown, and we need to go further in all of those ways: public, private, private, etc.
Okay, thank you. And Donald, so the future of public-private partnerships and the next evolution. We've talked about, or there is talk about fusion cells, about utilities, privacy-enhancing technology. You're at the front end of this at the moment. What's your views?
Depends which day of the week you ask me, I think. It's because it can be really positive, and we're moving forward, and then somebody says something, and here we go again, and we'll go around the same old arguments. So for my sins, I find myself chairing the Economic Crime Committee under UK Finance. And that means that if you go and read the UK Economic Crime Plan, if you really have got that much time to spare, then you'll find a whole chunk of actions in there that are joint actions. So they're down to one or more government agencies, and usually it's UK Finance. So it's the banking industry which is trying to drive this work from the private sector perspective. And probably that's because we have more skin in the game. I do know which bank that you're talking about with 6,000 people, but that's not abnormal. The level of resource in there that is finding nothing, that 97%. So if you look at the consent regime, the fact that many banks get consent in somewhere around 98% of the requests they put forward. What was the point in that 98%? Other than self-protection. So we have an opportunity we have a skin in the game to try and make this better, to try and make it more effective. We have skin in the game in terms of customer impact. Where could we get to? So the stuff that we're talking about, the prioritization agenda, the ability to dial up resources on those things that are impactive to deal with a priority, the ability to dial down resources and effort on the stuff that isn't a priority, the stuff that, Ewan, we've been having conversations with UK FIU about what are the real low utility SARs that we could perhaps drop down. What do we do about building a joint capability to understand and analyze the data from banks, a group of banks, and law enforcement and government? Because one thing that we ran a fusion pilot a year ago, we're working through the potential for a second pilot. That's what it really showed us, was the lack of mutual understanding of what data is held, what you can learn from it between law enforcement and the private sector. Bring the two together, and you have a heck of an increase in capability. There's a real opportunity there to build something that is a standing joint capability to draw together large-scale data sets and understand them against typologies. And the other thing, just on the typology piece, there's a lot of good work being done on typologies now. It's getting steadily more refined, more accurate. The reason that's the case from a UK perspective is that overwhelmingly, those typologies are written jointly. They are written with private sector input. I could point to the majority of those that come out in the last 12 months in the UK that have had 60-70% input from people in banks who've sat there and written them with law enforcement. It is not give and get this wonderful analysis back. It's do the work together and get something that's more worthwhile. There is a real opportunity here. There's a way to get this done. It is tough. to get there, and it's tough because of the scale. I think Nick's absolutely right. You have a huge opportunity from a Jersey perspective. There's a huge opportunity, I think, from the Quad Island Forum perspective, because you can get people together, people know each other, you can actually get the significant players in one room and really focus. Mm-hmm. You have a real opportunity there, and do what we're doing, in the sense of we're looking around at what others are trying to do. We had the UK-US dialogue, government and banking, a couple of weeks ago. One of the key messages that came out of that was the US has tried prioritization. So we're not going to do it that way, because the US approach to prioritization turned out to be, all of these things, like everything from terrorist financing all the way through to local lotteries. It's all a priority. That doesn't work. So learn from others, learn from their mistakes, and you have the opportunity to build something really effective here.
Well, just with your Quad Island hat on and your imminent taking over the chairmanship of that role, a challenge for you is I think one of the key areas that PPPs haven't evolved well into is cross-border collaboration. So EFIP exists. It's existed for a long time now, but it only shares typological data. So can't get to sharing case data at all. If the Quad Island can show how 4 jurisdictions can work together to work collaboratively on cases, that would be a huge win and a lesson that could be learned by all jurisdictions around how you can, with coalitions of the willing, you can break through some of those really intransigent barriers around privacy, cross-border sharing. That'd be
absolutely, and that is already on our agenda, and I know sort of Edgar's been driving some work on that, and we have got some collaborations, and as I alluded to, actually there's one that's ongoing at the moment that involves a couple of the Quad members and a bank and other Gimlet members as well. So there's hope, but I absolutely take Nick's point. The opportunity is here, the opportunity is now, the opportunity is with you to engage with us to be able to drive this forward. Thank you very much. A wealth of insight from a wealth of bankers. Excusing that, Chris. So buckle in now, I think, as we change pace slightly and focus, and we think much more about our good friends and allies who bring a unique insight into our intelligence assessments. Like I said, we can't do it just on our own, and there are others who see things very differently and have different understanding. We are incredibly lucky today to have a very good friend of ours who's given some time and energy and travelled from all the way from Dubai. Our friend Eamon Dean, and Eamon is truly an expert on the Middle East and on terrorism and illicit finance and terrorist financing. Eamon is the managing director for Cruikshank and Dean. He's a published author, he's a podcaster, and if you have interest in all things Middle East and the threat dynamic and haven't listened to the podcast Conflicted, then I would encourage you to do so. Eamon is globally acclaimed for his expertise in Middle East geopolitics and his depth of understanding on Islamic extremism, jihad, and the conflict psyche, as well as being renowned for his insights on financial crime, having worked for HSBC for 10 years. His understanding of terrorist financing and all related risks, including as an expert witness on terrorist financing matters, is undeniable. He is also unknown to many of you as probably one of the bravest amongst us. He trained as a mujahideen and subsequently worked for MI6 as their most well-placed covert agent within the terrorist group Al-Qaeda. He has a unique insight, therefore, about their ideology and the motivations of being both within a terrorist group, but also how terrorist financing works and the complexities of the Middle East in particular. Eamon, I'd like to invite you to the stage.
so much, everyone. Okay. I'm going to do my best, to condense everything into 25 minutes. Usually I do this course over a day. Sometimes it takes 8 hours. Seriously, it's a day. It takes a day. Sometimes even 2. I think Jonathan remembers when I got the top executives of HSBC to sit for a whole day, for this. I don't know how I was able to gather them all in one room. It's like putting, lots of roosters in one room. Anyway, so I'm going to talk, just to condense as much as possible, the history of terror financing from, within the Muslim world context. Because, of course, unfortunately, we face a reality that the civil war within the Muslim world has touched many corners of the globe, and therefore the impact of that civil war within the Muslim world would be felt, from the Philippines all the way to the United States. And therefore, understanding the flow of money is important for combating this phenomenon. And it's not just a question of understanding the, the flow, or understanding the motives. Why do people give in the first place? The geopolitical realities of these conflicts and the emotive or the emotions they invoke to get people to actually do what some people will think is counterintuitive, to give generously to such causes, and why such causes are attractive to some people to support. So without further ado, we have to understand that whenever some people always ask me about terrorism finance in the Middle East, and I ask them which one, because we have 2. There are 2 types of terrorism right now taking place in the Middle East. So if I want to talk about both forms of terrorism finance, and I'll be talking about sushi, Sunni and Shia. So, I just conjure up like a ninja jihadist there. And so, as you know, Islam is split into 2 major denominations, Shia Muslims who are predominantly in Iran, and in Iraq, and in Lebanon and Yemen, as well as parts of Pakistan and Afghanistan. And then you have the Sunni majority, roughly about 75% of Muslims are Sunnis, about 20% of Muslims are Shia. But within the Middle East, the Shia make about 1/3. And of course, they have a state sponsor, which is Iran. And this is why it is important to understand that when we talk about terrorism finance within the Middle East, there are 2 separate, distinct groups. So if I ask everyone here, basically, how many of you already know the difference between Shia and Sunni Islam? Raise your hand. Good, perfect. Many of you, thank you. I was just, sarcastic here. Shia Islam is the equivalent of Catholicism. It's just a hierarchical religion. Basically, it's organized religion. And Sunni Islam is chaotic and has no central authority and no religious central authority. Basically, it is, a faith that leaves the governance, to statesmen, kings, princes, tribal chiefs, etc. However, in Shia Islam, especially with the revival of the system of the stewardship of the Grand Cleric that Ayatollah Khomeini revived in 1979 during the Islamic Revolution, we now have a proper religious theocratic state in Iran. And therefore, why we have to understand this? We have to understand it because Shia terrorist groups are very different from Sunni terrorist groups when it comes to financing, when it comes to discipline, when it comes to rationality, when it comes to strategy, and how they deploy their assets around the globe. And of course, what kind of aim and goal do they have? Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Shabab, Taliban, these are all, and Boko Haram in Nigeria, as well as AQIM in the Sahel, ISIS in Afghanistan and Pakistan, some of the terror groups in Africa, especially in East Africa, these are all Sunni and quite fragmented. In Pakistan also you have Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Muhammad, Jaish-e-Kashmir, and all of these groups that are fighting in the Indian subcontinent. They're all also Sunni. when we talk about Hezbollah, when we talk about the Houthis, when we talk about the Quds force of the Iranian IRGC, and the Shia Iraqi militias, of course, we are talking about Shia groups. Each of these have different means of funding, different ideology, and different aims and goals. And so we will go quickly and understand that within Sunni Islam, you have the zakat, which is the religious taxation that Muslims have to pay. The past 100 years saw the collapse of the state's responsibility in collecting the zakat on behalf of the population. When you talk about 2 billion people, and each of the, let's say, heads of households of these 2 billion people around the world need to perform the duty of paying the zakat. Therefore, you are talking about hundreds of billions of dollars every year. But of course, most of it goes into what it's supposed to go to, which is the feeding of the poor, looking after the needy within the society. However, this phenomenon of the state relinquishing this important duty has led to the emergence of groups and clerics who became more powerful within the society, and that led to the rise of extremism that is more or less insubordinate to the state because the fact that they are now financially more wealthy, and therefore they became more, how can I say, rebellious in their nature. And then you have the how can I say, the voluntary contributions that people were giving in order to give to good causes. And then, of course, basically the question of Tajhiz al-Ghazi, which is a sponsoring of field jihadists. This phenomenon started in modern times in 1979. Many of you here will know the year 1979. It was a very charming year, indeed. In that year, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. In that year, the Islamic Revolution in Iran. In that year, Saddam Hussein became the president of Iraq in a coup. What could possibly go wrong? Also, in 1979, a group of extremists seized the Grand Mosque in Mecca, forcing the Saudi royal family to, regress and go back into more conservative form of Islam. So the year 1979 was a jinxed year, to say the least, and that led to the revival of the jihad concept within the Muslim world, the contemporary Muslim world. Why? Because of what the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Why the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was so important? Because, of course, the Soviets were not going to stop at Afghanistan. They were going to continue into Baluchistan of Pakistan. And from there, they will have finally achieved what the Russians were seeking for 400 years, a warm water port, which is in Gwadar, which is ironically now is controlled by the Chinese. Whatever the Soviets always failed, the Chinese seem to have succeeded. And then, of course, if they were to have that port, they will be threatening the energy supplies that were coming out of the Gulf at that time. That would have actually caused even the possibility of a nuclear war in the North Indian Ocean. So this is why the White House, the Gulf countries decided that the Soviets should never have an easy time in Afghanistan. And if it means supporting the ideology of jihad at the time, then so be it. You make it as you go, you improvise. And that's exactly what happened. No one had a crystal ball. No one saw that, in 20 years, there would be planes flying into the World Trade Center in New York. And this is why we have to understand that for Sunni groups such as Al-Qaeda, the recruitment and fundraising go hand in hand. So this Tajhiz al-Ghazi system, where they recruit people and fund them to travel to theaters of jihad. It was first Afghanistan, then Bosnia, then Chechnya, and then after that Iraq and Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan again, and now possibly Sudan, and now soon it will be another theater, God help us. So this is why the recruitment and the fundraising go hand in hand. So you have dedicated fundraising networks, and you have the recruitment, because when the recruits are ready to go, then the fundraising, dedicated fundraising facilitators will hand them the money in order to take it with them. So if each one can carry about $10,000 with them, then perfect. But when you talk about a place like Syria, where 25,000 people came from abroad to join ISIS alone, can you imagine if each one of them was given a $10,000 and 25,000? You do the math and you understand how it is important, this way of funding. And this is where I remember when I was explaining this, to my colleagues in the past in HSBC, and they reached the conclusion somehow that, okay, but Ayman, explain to us, where is the connection here with the banking sector? And I said, well, it's quite minimal. And so they reached the conclusion that maybe it was authorities, just shifting the blame, of their failure on the banking sector. And there's some truth to this, because the reality is that on the ground, at least from a Sunni group perspective, the interaction between fundraising and transfer of funds through couriers and through Hawala system was more or less away from the prying eyes of the banking regulators in the banking sector. Then you have, of course, charities shouldering legitimate expenses. How many of you here heard so much about charities supporting terrorism? Yeah, many. Would it surprise you to say that the level of support was, to some extent, not as great as people might think? There were other forms of funding, but nonetheless, I would say that the charities were more clever about it. They were shouldering legitimate expenses, such as the welfare of the deceased fighters' families, or wounded fighters or wounded civilians who are under the care of terror groups who just happen to be in control of a territory. So they will come, they will say to any particular group, well, look, how many people you are looking after that are a drain on your budget? Well, I have 100 families to feed. Well, we will feed them. Whatever you were allocating for them, we will take care of that. This way, they will mask their work as legitimate, knowing full well that the money would be then diverted to whatever that group is trying to do militarily. Then, of course, you have the kidnap for ransom. Without mentioning any names, thanks to a certain insurance company and thanks to their own partners, how many millions do you think has been paid to terror groups since 2001? Almost $180 million. So if you are thinking about stopping $50,000 here and £10,000 there, and just think of the fact that in the same city, in the same vicinity, there is a insurance company that paid significant amount of money to terror groups like Al-Qaeda in Yemen, Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb, AQIM, in order to free hostages. And that, of course, led, by saving one life, you kill 10,000. What a bargain. And then, of course, you have the raids on local banks and gold reserves. These are aggressive means of funding, of course. And then you have the confiscation of assets, which happened when ISIS took over Mosul, Raqqa, Tikrit, Ramadi in Iraq, and they confiscated large quantities of gold. 460 kg of gold, were confiscated from the Central Bank of Mosul and other banks there. And of course, the confiscation of farms, the confiscation of vehicles, the confiscation of cash and other assets. And that required territories, of course. Then you have the internal self-reliance. So we know about the exploitation of natural resources, oil and coal. For example, ISIS used oil, but Al-Shabaab in Somalia were using coal and copper, and they employ child labor, unfortunately, in the mines in order to sell where? They are not selling it in Somalia. They are selling it in Ethiopia, they are selling it in Uganda, and they're selling it in Kenya. And then, of course, you have the exploitation of the trade routes and services. I mean, this is important because when they are in control of a territory, they can tax whatever that is coming through. You know, a truck carrying food, a truck carrying equipment would be taxed accordingly. Then, of course, you have the religious taxation, the zakat or the kharaj, they do on farms, on cattle herders. And someone will ask me, like, why am I talking about zakat on crops? I mean, how does it, impact us here? Well, it is because of this that the United States spent $2 trillion and 20 years of blood and sweat, and in the end, they went with their tail between their legs. Why? Because they neglected to understand the basics of religious taxation, and they neglected the fact that the Taliban had a full list of all the owners of farms and cattle herds all across Afghanistan, and therefore they just went back to their former patrons and started collecting the religious taxation. And one particular crop was the backbone of the Taliban's ability to withstand 19 NATO nations pounding them day after day for 20 years. That was opium. If it grows, it's taxable. Therefore, they justified it, religiously, and they decided that, if we need between 10 to 5% of the 5 to 10% of the returns on this crop, and that was about $120 million a year. That's more than enough for them to sustain themselves. Something that the American policymakers somehow decided that it's just beneath them to understand, and it is just something that is insignificant, when in fact, it cost them $2 trillion and cost them their reputation. The establishment of business networks, I don't want to go into too much into this because I don't have that much time, but nonetheless, all I can say is that ISIS used to buy businesses in Iraq and Turkey. In fact, in Turkey, they even bought existing licensed money service shops like Western Union, MoneyGram, and other forms, as well as gold shops and pawn shops even, which is basically it goes against the essence of their religion, but nonetheless, they did that in order to not only just to survive, but also to use these businesses as an intelligence gathering network as well as logistics network. And of course, the charities, we already talked about it before, the pharmaceutical, this is something that I've noticed throughout, my 24 years, in this sector, which is the fact that the war zones attract pharmaceutical needs, such as morphine, painkillers, anesthetics, everything you can imagine. And especially if there is, because of the collapse of the supply chain, people who are in chronic illnesses such as diabetes and hypertension and heart and vascular diseases. So the need for all these medicines mean that Syria and Iraq alone represented $700 million market value for ISIS and for Jabhat al-Nusra al-Qaeda at that time in terms of the importation of medicine into these places and then selling them to the population. So also at the same time, the antiquities, all of us know how much of Iraq and Syria's and Yemen's heritage has been stripped bare and then ended up in the markets of Hong Kong and Singapore and Shanghai and elsewhere. As well as, of course, the black market in human organs. Many people used to go to Turkey at that time, not knowing that the sudden availability of human organs between 2014 and 2019 was due to the fact that ISIS used to harvest the bodies of those who used to kill for organs, and the medical tourism, unfortunately, exploded at that time without lots of people looking into it. And basically, this is my chairman, basically saying, thank you so much for listening to my babble. I will just leave it basically for now, and there will be question and answer session. And I'm amazed how I was able to condense all of this. Actually, I didn't explain the Shia one, but anyway, I will explain it later then. Thank you.
I told you to strap in, and it was certainly turbocharged sort of theologian and Middle Eastern and history. Every time I listen to Eamon, I learn something more and sort of think about things in a very different way. So I hope you did as well, and we will sort of in a moment bring in sort of up to the panel to be able to speak with 2 or 3 others. But a fascinating insight as always, Eamon. Thank you very much. As I mentioned, we now want to sort of have a panel that can think about this a degree more. Of course, it is critical that the FIU holds partnerships with informed connections, with authors, with those that have been on the other side, on academics and think tanks, because they all understand the threat slightly differently and they can all add to that particular picture. So I'd now like to sort of welcome to the stage my argument of academics or scribble of authors that includes Pia Home as our own Jersey Financial Services Commission terrorist financing and proliferation financing expert, last year having completed her master's dissertation in counterterrorism studies. To be joined by Ned Conway, Santander's senior executive team member on financial crime at a global level. Ned is the co-author of Counterterrorism and Threat Finance Analysis During Wartime. This seminal work details the very first realization and reactive setup by the Americans to understanding and tackling terrorist financing during and in a war zone, both in Iraq and Afghanistan. And of course, Eamon as well, if you'd like to join me up here. So thank you very much. So we sort of sit here, I suppose, thinking about financial crime, and the understanding and interest in financial crime has grown in the general populace's sort of mindset over the last 10 or so years. It's been depicted in Hollywood, in Netflix, and in all sorts of other media. There's numerous books, podcasts, university sort of courses, all of the rest of it, think tank papers. And you've all obviously contributed to that. But I've also heard that it doesn't matter what the academic view is. It doesn't matter what that view is. We need to be sort of practical about this. We need to tackle the criminality. We need to have effect. What would sort of, being sort of authors and being sort of commentators or doing academic study, what would you sort of say to that? Starting perhaps with Eamon at the end.
Well, sometimes you see some, the reality is reflected actually sometimes in what you see in Netflix or in the drama, because sometimes you see, you monitor cross-border smuggling of illicit, products, whether it's narcotics or counterfeit goods, and then you see, of course, human trafficking happening, which is profiting certain organizations. You see the correlation between terrorism and terrorist actors, as well as sanctioned entities, as well as money laundering, all together at the same place, in the same route. Weapons smuggling, you will see it also in the same route, within the same group. So this is why once you get involved in monitoring terrorism finance, you see that it is related to organized crime, illicit trade, related to smuggling, related to people who are working even in human trafficking. You see all of this correlation, and then you see that also that it relates to state sponsors of terror, because they have their own aims and goals of delivering whatever weapons and cash and equipments they need to their proxies within the region or within the world. So, and since a lot of this is happening through networks of expats living all across the world, from the jungles of Paraná in Brazil all the way to the Philippines, and you see everything in between, you know immediately that this is not fiction, this is real life.
Excellent. Pia?
Well, in terms of the glamorization, I think that there is a part of it that has been exploited by terrorists. So, for example, in terms of Daesh, you mentioned it previously, there was a wave of foreign fighters. Sure, they were also driven by a religious narrative to go there. However, there were very glamorous sort of media shots and YouTube videos. So that might bring into scope where it might look attractive, because it's fairly rarely that you see the sort of grubby side in true terms. I also think that when it comes to the internet, we are all getting desensitized, perhaps, in terms of what we're watching. And, you know, there's an accessibility now compared to what there were previously, where you had more regulated media and you had more sources that you could sort of, to some degree, rely upon. Now it's much broader. So I do think that many people might be affected badly in terms of it, look at it as a glamorous way, a way of perhaps earning a lot of money through the serious organized crime series, I don't know, narcos and things like that. I think that's, you know, that probably happens. I think so.
Great. Ned?
Yeah, first of all, Eamon's giving me flashbacks now of all my mistakes that I've made over the last several years, especially back in the Iraq War days, so I'm kind of conflicted internally now about where to focus. But listen, I'd say the first thing, what is absolutely clear and where there's what is absolutely true as you see in Hollywood versus real life, and this is picking up on the points that were made by Pia and Eamon, is that the threat is real. I mean, that's the one thing that's clear, right? So and you can see this actually play out in real life when you have, you know, more kind of liberal governments come in and they have quite a lot of policies on privacy and this kind of thing. When they get on the inside and they get read in and they get that security clearance, you see very quickly how they shift their national security strategy, and that's because they realize that every single day there are, you know, bad actors trying to exploit weaknesses and attack all of the countries, you know, that we represent today in this room. That's kind of where I see a high alignment. Where I see a disalignment, absolutely, is on technology, okay? So, you know, when I was back in government and had the top secret squirrel clearance in the US government, and, you know, you'd go to the movies and you say, oh, that's not possible. Well, that's kind of possible, but not really how it works, you know, that kind of stuff. That was 2007, you know, 2005, 2006. What has changed since then, and what you don't see in the movies, to be honest, is how innovative payments have become over the last several years. I mean, the way that, you know, someone who is 18 can navigate the ability to send cross-border payments using all different types of channels, whether that's actual transfers of money or using these online marketplaces that themselves are not regulated, that has exploded. And what makes me the most nervous is that if I put my kind of, you know, 18-year-old hat on, you know, when I was paid by the government to try to find, you know, exploit weaknesses and find clever ways to shift money around, I just think of someone who's in that position now, 18, 19 years old, and they have so many tools in their toolkit, and staying ahead is quite challenging.
Interesting. When you talk about sort of that age, I know, Eamon, sort of the recruiting sergeant that sort of brought you into the Mujahideen and to go out to Bosnia was quite sort of dramatic in terms of how the messaging sort of came across to you. I don't know if you want to just sort of give us a flavour of it.
Well, of course, like, and I mean, the whole idea is the exploitation of grievances. I mean, point to any part of the world on the map. I mean, and you can't find any part of the world map that doesn't have grievances. But the question is, how do you exploit them for your own benefit? Whether these grievances are, you know, current events that you feel useless, not to do anything about them. You know, the suffering of certain people in faraway place that you want to be part of their, part of saving them. So this is, I think, one of the things when I was, talking to the team, yesterday when I was talking about the motivation of people giving. And this is why recruitment and fundraising go hand in hand together. I mean, if you target one, you have to target the other, because they will come to any, individual and they will say, well, I mean, are you happy with what's happening in Iraq? No. Are you happy the Americans are there? No. Do you see what happened in Abu Ghraib? Well, no. I'm not happy at all about what's happening there. Then what are you going to do about it? Are you going to sit on the side and just play dumb and that there is, You are not angry. And if you are angry, then what you should do about it. Because either you are angry and useless or angry and useful. And this is when they push you a bit by bit. And this is why I always used to say that the path to hell is paved with good intentions. People exploit that desperate need to do good within people to turn them into evil. I mean, you know, because at the end of the day, that's how they will address it. No one is going to tell you, say, hey, I have an interesting proposition for you. I want you to become a terrorist. It doesn't happen like this. It happens through the exploitation of the good nature of people. And goodness, like, I mean, one of the tragedies when I used to work undercover within places like Afghanistan and other, you know, and Arabia, is how the waste of life of so many young people who just started this journey with the best of intentions. And this is why I always think that that the deepest circle of hell is reserved for those who were recruiting them.
Interesting, thank you. Ned, sort of going back to you, you co-authored the Counterterrorism and Threat Finance Analysis During Wartime sort of book, which gives a really useful insight about how you transfer analytic methods into sort of, a conflict zone. Can you sort of tell us some of the biggest lessons that were learned during that?
Yeah, thanks. It's funny, Pia and I were talking during the coffee break and was essentially saying that, you know, the book is just full of all the failures that I made over the last several years and how, as an analyst, and I'm at my core, you know, just truly an analyst, you move into a war zone where instead of writing reports, passing off STRs or SARs or whatever to law enforcement, you actually, you know, pass that off to SEAL Team 4 and you say, Pia is a really important person in this network, and I think if we, you know, capture her, she'll disrupt the network fundamentally. So you hand that off, and those guys go out, and that night, you know, they pick her up, and the next day she's in the, you know, in the, what we call the gator pit for strategic debriefings, which is a really nice way of saying interrogations. And you know, what happens? The network continues, you know? So you've now found that feedback in real time. You thought you were, I have all these great ideas, you know, I've used these, you know, graph theory analysis to figure out who the critical nodes are in the network. You take out the critical node, and guess what? The network continues to, you know, to operate. So what was really beneficial and humbling was the kind of real-time feedback you got as you tried to execute operations based off of your intelligence. So what did I learn from that? A couple of things. One is sometimes it's not nearly as complicated as it thinks. You know, one of the questions that it sounds silly saying it out loud now, but you know, when you interrogate someone, you're often focused on other personalities, right? Other people who are key, right? Where does this person live? Show me on the map. You know, who are their close associates? All this kind of personality-focused stuff. When actually the much more illuminating questions are questions like, how much money do you make? Who pays you? How do you get paid? When do you get paid? And actually what you found is, from an interrogations perspective, people would talk about that freely, openly, because they didn't really think it was providing any value, whereas they knew, like, don't say where Jonathan Groom, you know, sleeps at night, you know, and that kind of stuff, right? And so that was incredibly illuminating, and it really allowed us to open up kind of how all this funding works, and it was very much in line, you know, with what Eamon was saying earlier. You have on the Sunni sides, heavy on control, heavy on taxation, you know, heavy on controlling, you know, certain areas and giving kind of their own social services to circumvent the government. On the Shia side, you know, much more about getting into the economies and kind of not necessarily front companies, but actually finding out what are those key sectors and getting involved with them, whether that was reconstruction or transport or whatever, right? But the last thing I'd say, though, is that it's also really easy, and you'll find this in any FIU and in any intelligence capacity, it's really easy to get lost in all the information that you have, all the intelligence that you have. It's coming in at all different angles. The same is true in a bank where we work now. We have, you know, this idea of transaction monitoring. I love Donald's comments on that because, and Chris's, because, you know, there's so much more now that we have in a bank than transactions. So this idea that we focus on that, you know, is really just because of the pressure we get. But there's so much data out there. And the biggest lesson learned is when you get overwhelmed, take a step back, take a deep breath. And this gets to the so what. And I've seen on your slides now a lot of so what. And I think there's a good so what for Jersey, which is, you know, look at the threat organization. How are they raising money? How are they moving money? How are they using money? And how are they storing money? It's those four things at the end of the day: raise, use, move, store, okay? And what does that mean to you? So, you know, think of that thread org, look at them, and say, what part of that chain is the part that touches Jersey? You know, and what are we doing about that? That's the key, because otherwise you just get lost and you go down these rabbit holes and you spend, you know, 97% of your resource on these kinds of things. So that's kind of the big picture. Come back and see just that four basic idea: how they raise, how they move, how they use, how they store. Everything comes back to that.
Yeah. Just sort of picking up on that sort of slightly. And so most sort of in war zones, it's sort of driven by kinetic actions. But do you think there was a missed opportunity, or there could be a growth opportunity, to be able to think much more strategically and globally about supply chains and about funding channels, rather than thinking sort of the tactical and the kinetic sort of effect?
Absolutely, and I know we're short on time, so I'll be quick. So two things that I think of immediately. One is, you know, I have the benefit of, because of all the mistakes I've made, I have the benefit of doing a lot of capacity training with FIUs around the world, and lately I've been spending a lot of time in East Africa, actually. East Africa, Kenya, Mozambique, South Africa as well, Tanzania. And the focus has been on heroin networks, to be honest, because there's been a lot of pressure put on the heroin transport routes, kind of going more the traditional routes, and so now there's something called the southern route. And the reason I raise that is because actually most of that programming and most of that capacity building is funded by the UK government, because that heroin ends up, you know, in the streets of London, right? But one of the things that you know, we focus quite a bit on there is looking at the whole supply chain of the threat, right? So looking at kind of how, you know, put yourself in the threat actor's perspective, look at kind of how they see risk, where are they most exposed, where are their vulnerabilities, you know, how do they look at finance, what are the avenues they take, their logistics, in kind of taking that supply chain focus. And there's quite a lot of really good lessons learned already out there. You don't have to reinvent the wheel on supply chain management and supply chain resiliency, and that's kind of one area. The one thing I'll say though as well is that as you guys pursue your strategy, which seems fantastic, you know, look at the kind of unintended consequences. One of the ones that jumps out at me is I spent a lot of time in 2009, I mean a lot of time, trying to get a threat organization in Iraq on the OFAC list as a SDN, as a specially designated national, right? That organization back then was not very well known. It was called Kataib Hezbollah, which is actually quite a big one now in Iraq if you're following kind of the day-to-day. And we spent so much time and so much effort getting together that package to put it in front of Treasury and get them to get on the list. And what happened? We got them on the list. We were like popping the champagne. And their recruiting went off the charts because they were a nothing organization. We had put the spotlight on them. The press release that the Treasury guys put out, you know, and they were holding it up like, look at us, we're number one. You know, so there's a lot of, you know, and a lot of attention needs to be paid to the unintended consequences of some very, you know, good intentions, but can spiral out of control really quickly. And that's why I think what I love about the mission you have here is this recognition at the beginning, at the center of everything is maintaining the reputation of the IFC. And if you keep that at the heart, I think the rest of it will come together.
Excellent, thank you. Peter, just sort of changing tack, of course, terrorism doesn't just come in one flavour. We've all learned from Eamon that even in the Middle East it comes in a number of flavours. But extreme right-wing incels and sort of broader radicalisation, especially sort of with this sort of growth and emergence post sort of the Hamas and Israel conflict and how the world is changing. Do you think that we are potentially more exposed to that here than we might necessarily be to, certainly not the Sunni side, because we understand that they don't necessarily invest as much, potentially the Shia side within our investment and trust sectors, but actually the extreme right wing could be much more sort of pertinent to us here?
I think that, to go back to what you said earlier, Ned, our exposure as an IFC really sits in the move, store, and I would say manage and obscure on top of that, right? That's the sector kind of, or the vulnerability that we're having in the main. And so it doesn't really matter who comes in. If it's a terrorist, an extremist that brings that kind of fund in, then we have a problem reputationally, whoever it is. We have a risk problem that's lethal, no matter what we do. But there is an element of me that think about the growth of the far right, for example, has happened in recent years. So if you read, for example, the 2022 Global Terror Index, there's some interesting statistics in that, which is showing a sort of decrease in terrorism across the globe, right? But it shows that in the West, last year, the 14 sort of ideologistically, is that what you say? Ideology-driven, motivated terrorist acts, the 14 in the West were all extreme far right. So I think that sort of tells you there's a drop in 95% of religiously motivated attacks in the West. So it sort of is this shift there that's worth thinking about. But I also think that, again, a recent report came out from the Commission of the Counter-Extremism Commission in the UK just the other day, and they were looking at incels in particular. So I don't know how familiar you are with them. They're worth reading about. It's a very sort of anti-female organization, but also a very lonely organization, a very isolated organization where parties are thinking very much about sort of suicide and very destructive thought processes. They spend an awful lot of time online, again in isolation, and watching extremist content and content that's coded in their community. And again there, perhaps the counter-terrorism regime, that kind of effort might not be the right approach. It might be more about mental health, for example. So you've got, there's a lot of complex pictures in terms of this, in terms of, you know, terrorism.
Yeah, definitely.
If I could just add on financing, the financing element is quite interesting when it comes to far-right extremism, because what we're seeing in Europe and in the US is that there's funding through a certain type of music and music events, and also through sort of mixed martial art events. So you've got black metal, for example. And that's not necessarily where you would go to think about how do we raise funds for what is an extreme organization and potentially lethal organization. But it's worthwhile thinking about. It's much more complex. It could be hidden anywhere, right? It's very diverse in terms of how to raise funds. But it is a trend there to see.
Yeah, interesting. Eamon, just sort of thinking about Israel and Hamas and how that's changed potentially the dynamic. Of course, we had the victim that then became the terrorist, and is now sort of viewed very differently from how it was on sort of day one of them being the subject of a terrorist attack. And during that time as well, Hamas has increased its charitable donations by about 70%. Across sort of Europe. And that is, again, driving opportunity to get sort of money into these sort of groups that they can then utilise. But how do we manage, how do we think about that? Sort of, because all of a sudden the thread is turned on its head.
One of the things I was talking about always is the fact that terrorism within the Middle East, North Africa, South Asia region tend to be cyclical. So, more or less like the stages of the moon. So, when the moon is in its infancy, it's just at the beginning of the month, you have, so this is when you have less gravity and, you have less trouble. But then, of course, when the moon is full, this is when, this is why you have the word lunatic from the word, in Latin word luna, because of course, people just lose their minds. I mean, this is exactly what's happening. So we had the full moon of Afghanistan, we had the full moon of Iraq, we had the full moon of Yemen, we had the full moon of Syria. And, gravitating lots of people towards that cause and, or that particular theater. And I was talking about a year ago in Brussels in a counterterrorism finance conference about the fact that we are now just in the phase of waiting for the new moon to come. And once that new moon comes, then you will find another rise in both recruitment and fundraising. Hamas, and what they did in October 7, as I stated many times before, and my public, pronouncements are very clear on this. Like, I mean, they did it not in the service of the Palestinian cause; they did it in the service of Iran. Their state sponsor is Iran. They didn't do it for any other purpose apart from a service for Iran and to sabotage the possibility of peace in the region, especially as the Saudis and the Israelis were reaching the final stages, of a historic agreement in the region. And this is why we come back to the question of state sponsorship. In the Shia side, like, I mean, even though Hamas is a Sunni, but like, the useful idiots of the Sunnis, I would call them. But even though, Iran is the state sponsor, but it is the proxies and the networks that they are using in order to move something close to about $75 billion a year. One of the things that, also something that some within the Western alliance don't understand or don't grasp is when they ask, like, how did Iran survive sanctions like this? I mean, the sanctions on Iran would cripple any nation except Iran, because Iran have a survival mechanism, through fundraising. And this survival mechanism that is, all over the world is just these letters, KHUMS, Khums, which means in Arabic 1/5 or the 20% religious taxation they levy on Shia across the world. So when you have 4 million Shia people living in Latin America, when you have that equal number also living in Canada and America, when you have that equal number or more living in Europe, and you have, of course, all across the Arab world and in the Gulf and Pakistan and Afghanistan, you are talking about $75 billion raised every year. And it goes through 2,060 funds, charities, trusts, and foundations. And they flow all over the world in the service of Iran. And, even from places such as London. I mean, there was a center that basically collecting every year 155 million pounds on behalf of the Grand Ayatollah of Iran. And it was just there in central London doing it, with the proper bank account for a bank owned by, a global philanthropist even. And so this is why we have to understand that, in order to, counter such phenomenon, you have to first think outside the box, because the other side is also thinking outside the box. And they are using, a perfect amalgamation of the simple and the sophisticated. And therefore, if you are trying to think, how to counter that, you have to think at their wavelength, tune into their, frequency, and do not try to do it just at your own frequency.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to move across to Slido, sort of conscious of our time and things. And what I might do as well, we'll sort of carry on a couple of TF questions, but I might sort of bring some of the other panelists in to answer a question as well as we go through. But one here from Johan Kraus. You've not mentioned cyber risk and the role of cyber attacks in generating funds for terrorists and unfriendly regimes. How do you think we can respond to that?
Okay. Well, crypto has been used, significantly by the IRGC in Iran, by Hezbollah, by Hamas. In fact, Hamas was openly publishing, the numbers of their wallets. This is my wallet address, like, and certain exchanges, and in particular Binance, were as guilty as charged, like, in facilitating that and the movement of billions of dollars, in currency coming from and to Iranian and Iranian-linked accounts. That's one thing. And the second thing is that, someone asked the question, do they engage in cyber attacks in order to, to fraud, for fraud and stealing and, diverting of funds? I haven't seen any evidence yet that this is the case. From either like a Sunni side or the Shia side, I haven't seen any evidence yet that this is the case, that they would do any, like a ransomware or whatever. This is more, seems to be something perfected by Russian organized crime, North Koreans, Chinese, but I haven't seen any evidence that Iranians or Lebanese people are, linked to Hezbollah are involved in this?
Ned, yeah, just real quick, because I think this is key as you kind of think about the next 5 years. Cyber is a really interesting one because it highlights a couple of things. One, a lot of financial crime compliance departments don't collaborate nearly as well as they should with their own cyber departments, all right? So that's kind of a within your own family, understanding the capabilities they have. Equally, by the way, we find that our cyber guys don't know much about what we do. So when we sit down together and we compare notes, we're kind of like, oh, I didn't know you could do that. And they're like, well, I didn't know you could do that, And so we start to think of more holistic typologies. The fact that we're going so digital is changing that quite a bit. We did a really interesting work with human trafficking where we were, essentially looking at geolocation data in known human trafficking hotspots in Mexico, and that collaboration between cyber and financial crime was really, really illuminating. The other side of it, though, is one, cyber departments have somehow cracked the code on private-to-private collaboration because they are way better, the cyber departments, at collaborating amongst them than the fin crime guys are. So there's a lesson learned there for sure. But the final one I'll say, Jonathan, which is really key for you guys in your team, is that there's no way that you or the law enforcement bodies you support will fully appreciate the capabilities that the private sector has unless you literally go in and sit down with the analysts and see them do their work, okay?
Yeah.
The reason I say that is because I was in South Africa not that long ago, and we were explaining all these new capacities and technologies that we have as a sector, not just as a Santander. And this really elite organized crime, unit within the South African government, they call them the Hawks. A guy stood up and said, "Listen, our subpoena checklist to do a court order against the bank doesn't even have the boxes in the checklist to talk about the data points you're explaining. I didn't even know anything about that, nor do we even have the infrastructure set up for that. And there's no way to break through that unless you go literally and sit down with those guys and they walk you through a case, and it will just open your eyes and your partner's eyes on how this kind of 19th century view of let's ask for the last 2 years of transactions and the KYC documents is like the least interesting component of unraveling the network."
Yeah. Interestingly, we're talking and likely to join the Cyber Defence Alliance in the UK.
Yeah.
Later this year, and we're talking with sort of the UK NEC as well as to this threat convergence. We've already sort of spoken with Matt and things sort of here, and just in terms of the threat environment that we live in and how that all comes together. So we do.
If I could just, that philosophy though, extended across to other areas. The JFIN legal, JFIN business stuff that you guys are doing, I think is phenomenal because I'll be honest, I'm totally lost when I talk to legal in these kinds of other service providers. And that same philosophy absolutely applies. And I love this idea. Very selfishly thinking about you guys as like a sandbox because of your size, because of your commitment, because of the collaboration, to explore all these things that, to be honest, bigger jurisdictions should be exploring. But it seems so complicated. So there's a lot to learn from what you guys are going to do over the next 5 years.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. And I think it's a good analogy. We're small enough to be able to try these things. I'll just pick out sort of a couple of these other questions to try and answer for you. So Kaz asks, the JFSC collects vast amounts of data from industry for informing risk-based supervision and in aggregated form for national risk assessments. Is the current NRA model, which is Government of Jersey led, with significant input from the FIU and the JFSC, broken? Well, I don't think so. There are different models to do NRAs. We've sat and we've had a national level risk meeting and committee that comes together, and we're looking at the methodology that is being used. The World Bank methodology, which has been adapted, has been what's been chosen before, but we also recognize there are very other and different and capable things. And the national risk assessment methodology approach is being sort of reviewed globally with different types and approaches. So we are all joined together, and I am personally very focused on making sure that whatever that says, it is relevant and pertinent to the jurisdiction, and it's not just being done for the sake of money, val, or FATF. It has to be useful. Otherwise, there's no point in doing it. And we are now also aligning a lot of our products to what the National Risk Assessment says, so that we can start to test that in everything that we do as well. So that becomes pertinent, that becomes relevant. Is the SARS reporting model defunct and what would work better? Well, that's probably an incredibly large question for somebody like Donald over lunch or Ewan. It's the system that we have, and I think if the system is used better and we focus on quality, not quantity, then there's an opportunity to make it and drive it as a source of information. SARS, to me, are not intelligence. It is just your suspicion. The more detail we get, the more we can corroborate with other sources, the more valuable that SAR becomes. But it needs the detail in it, and it needs that sort of insight from you. Is the financial intelligence world male-dominated? How many women work at FIU-Jersey? From Anonymous. I think we're incredibly proud, actually, in FIU-Jersey that we're pretty much at a 50-50 split between women and between men. We also have a diverse workforce. I am a firm believer that an intelligence agency should have as much diversity as it should. We should not all be from the same educational background, from the same sort of cultural background, from the same religious background or anything. We have to have diversity across the piece. And like I said, we're incredibly proud that actually we do have a very strong coverage. And I think across the world, actually, financial intelligence, when we turn up to Egmont, there's a really good split, actually, between sort of male and female, isn't there?
Jonathan, can I add something there, being the female on the panel? I mean, diversity is much bigger than male and female. So it's important. That's why the collaboration and the partnerships are so important, both internationally and domestically. But there are a couple of things that I want to point out with partly in jest, I suppose. One is that Osama bin Laden was caught by a female intelligence officer, right? That's quite important. And then there's another writer, Jessica Davis. If you haven't read anything about her, or from her, or by her, or followed her in any way, I would strongly recommend you to do that. She's a fantastic terrorist financing expert. So there are plenty of females out there as well.
So thank you very much, Pia. I think on that, just because of timing, we're going to have to pull it to a close. But if we can just sort of thank our panel very much. So you can remain there, or you can. I've got a minute to end. In closing, I'd like to thank you all for your engagement and attendance today. It is for you, and without you, we cannot sort of achieve anything. So I finish today with real pride and enthusiasm for not only what we have achieved in this past year, but also what we can achieve going forward. And that's not just the FIU, that is collectively. And I take those messages from numerous of our panelists that there's a real opportunity here for Jersey. I'm incredibly excited, and as I hope you are, at those opportunities ahead. Whilst building and growing, rest assured we continue to focus on our core deliverables. Operational analysis, strategic insight, and international cooperation will remain. And so I leave you with a value challenge, and that's that my experience tells me that threats are never-ending and all-pervading. You can win every battle but lose the war. Tactical successes are not the end game here. We need to be operationally joined to strategically value each other and change the threat environment. Success comes, therefore, with joint efforts and preemptive approaches. So I'd like you to talk more, share more, and find more, but it must be valuable to that last point. Quality absolutely matters. Only through collaboration and partnerships will we collectively make a difference. We're reliant on each other on this. Thank you very much.